Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the AltMed podcast. Here, as always, my co-host Mitch Kurtz, and
Hello.
it's our pleasure to have on the show today Dr. Joe Kosterich. Joe, welcome.
Mitch, Andrew, great to be with you.
Thank you very much.
We've got a lot to cover today, I feel, because you've been involved, with one of the biggest medicinal cannabis companies in Australia over in WA in Little Green Pharma. And I think we'll get to that. But before we do, if you could take us through your background and how you kind of came to be involved in medicinal cannabis.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting and good question. And as is often the case in life, it's, I suppose, who you know and who you've dealt with and different aspects of the industry that you've been involved with. So Fleeta Solomon, who's the CEO of Little Green Pharma, rang me up in early 2017. She and I had worked together with some other people, Paul Long, who's also involved in Little Green Pharma as Chief Operating Officer. We'd worked in a business in the mid-2000s, which is called On-Site Health Solutions, and that was delivering wellbeing and health programs mainly, or to industry, but mainly on mine sites in WA, which were booming then and booming again. And that was in the mid-2000s. Ultimately, the business got sold. People went their different ways. And Fleeta rang me up pretty much, and we'd been in touch periodically out of the blue and said, look, I've been asked to look at this opportunity in medicinal cannabis, and was really, I suppose, initially seeking my take as to whether, for want of a better term, is this kosher? Is this something, is this something worthwhile? It's the laws have just been changed. Can I suss it out from a medical perspective and give my view? And look, I did, and came back and said, look, this is, it's obviously new here. It's been going in other countries for longer. It's not, a panacea for every element that everybody's got, but it certainly has validity and can be of benefit. And one thing led to the next, and as the company formed, I was asked to become on board as medical advisor. And as part of nearly 4 years later, I'm still here.
Amazing. So had you been prescribing medicinal cannabis before you came on board with
Well, ultimately, the laws changed in 2017. I think, really right through 2018, there weren't that many prescriptions issued. So ultimately, I've had an involvement in the business before I was in the position to be able to prescribe.
Sure.
And Vicky Kotzrillis, I think, was the first general practitioner to prescribe in Australia, because in those days, it had to be approved by a specialist. And the application process was enormously complex. And then gradually, as different jurisdictions made it a little bit less onerous for doctors and prescribe, in particular enabling GPs to prescribe. Western Australia was the second last and moved down that path at the end of 2019. I'd had a few patients on it before then, but that required me up until then to get supporting letters from specialists, some of whom were agreeable, and others it was really quite difficult. Post November 2019, when the laws here were changed to enable GPs to prescribe without the input of specialists, I think I've put in about 260 plus, applications through SASB, to treat people with medicinal cannabis.
And what's the response been like? I mean, just in sort of a general, your clinical observations from your experience. We hear it, obviously it can work for some people, it doesn't work for others. Perhaps are you able to very, broadly and non-specifically share your experiences?
There's no medication of any description that works equally well for everybody. If there was one medication that lowered everybody's blood pressure and didn't cause side effects, we wouldn't have 50 or 80 or such on the market. Same with antidepressants, same with diabetes medications, same with asthma sprays. So medicinal cannabis certainly does help people, and in particular, I suppose, with sleep, chronic pain, anxiety. Look, I won't go through the entire list. I'm sure your listeners are familiar with it. In terms of response rates, look, the numbers that are tossed around, and I'd say my findings would be broadly consistent with it, is something in the order of 3/4 or so of people will get a reasonable response. Some people get a very good response. There are those who get dramatic improvement, whether it's in their pain, their anxiety levels, their tremor. Some people unfortunately get no response, and that's with all medications, and everybody else is somewhere in the middle. So look, if you had to say what happens with most people, I'd say the majority will get improvement. Now, if you then say to what extent, that is necessarily variable.
And in your experience, how much of that variable nature of the response is due to the product, or due to just the individual? Do you have experience? I'm assuming you have experience with a lot of different kinds of products. So it could be different sources of products. It could be different types of products. For example, CBD versus THC, and making sure they're on the one that fits that particular indication.
Look, this also becomes complicated, because at times, if we're making decisions, say chronic pain, probably the best one. If you're making decisions on treatment and it was purely on clinical grounds, in most instances, you probably go for formulation which is equal parts THC and CBD. Now, there are people who, for a variety of reasons, are not necessarily in a position to do that. They may be subject to workplace testing. They may need to drive quite a bit. They may have concerns about THC. So one may end up using a different formulation. Look, I've had people who have been on equal. So again, use pain as the example because it's probably the most frequent application.
Sure.
People have been on equal parts who then went to CBD dominant. People have gone the other way. Look, I think it is about finding the right formula, but I suspect that generally when there isn't a response, my estimate would be in most instances it's going to be for some people, it's just not really helpful for them. And yes, it's worth adjusting dose and adjusting formulation. But this is with all medications, there are some people where, for whatever reason, they're just not responders, and that's not anybody's fault. There's no way of knowing or testing that in advance. There's a little bit of a side now. There are some tests that can be done, genetic tests, to try and predict response to certain medications, particularly some of the antidepressants and some other psychiatric medications. Now, we haven't got that for cannabis, and we know everybody has an endocannabinoid system, but that also doesn't mean that everybody will respond in the same way. And part of the reason for that is that what might be driving their symptoms might be other than issues in the endocannabinoid system.
Interesting. And I did pick up on one thing you said before about maybe a reduction in tremors, for example. I'm very interested in exploring a bit more of that area, because that's something we have been meaning to look at on this podcast series, but we haven't gotten into that area. The kind of neurological, maybe Parkinson's realm. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that particular indication, MS, some of the muscle spasticity, that region is something we'd love to extrapolate a bit on and get the benefit of your experience.
Look, Parkinson's disease is again one of these conditions where there's no particularly known cause, and generally speaking, people become resistant to the medications that they're on. There are two main ones that are used, levodopa and carbidopa. There are a couple of others, and all the specialists will always, like any doctor will say, you sort of hold off with starting these medications because eventually people are going to need higher doses and then become resistant to them. And they can also cause some nasty side effects also on the muscles. So medicinal cannabis, particularly in an older age group, I've had a number now, generally beyond the age of 75, and often Parkinson's does affect an older age group, where at surprisingly lowish doses, and typically in that age group, you often can use the 10-10, which seems to be best for Parkinson's. There are people who argue use THC dominant. There are people who argue, use CBD dominant. Again, we don't have an absolute answer to this, but the balanced formulations do seem to improve neuromuscular function, and this is almost certainly through through workings in the endocannabinoid system, and on some of the receptors. So by variably improving that functionality, we do find these people have less tremor. They also have less rigidity. And we see that in some forms, and you touched on that, Andrew, of spasticity. And there are a number of different neuromuscular conditions that can cause spasticity. Some of them are quite rare. They don't get a lot of airplay. I will confess that since I've started in this field, I'm seeing people from right around the metro area, and people are coming in with conditions that, quite frankly, I've not seen before, and won't pretend to any particular familiarity with. And by the time these people are coming in, often with spasticity issues, they've quite rightly, they've seen doctors, they've been to neurologists, and are often told, look, there really isn't much that can be done, which again is nobody's fault. It's just the nature that these conditions don't have any specific cure, and often no underlying sort of cause. Some of them with spasticity have responded very well to cannabis, and in multiple sclerosis, we see some people do remarkably well with medicinal cannabis. Also, usually in equal parts of THC and CBD. One never should be dogmatic with this. And, some people not as much. MS, by its nature, will wax and wane. So almost no matter what treatments people are on, they'll have periods where they're better and periods where they're worse. Some of the newer, what they call biologic medicines, are having a positive impact in MS compared to, say, 15, 20 years ago. But for symptom relief, often they do quite well. And pain also in MS, often people do quite well. But Parkinson's in the older age group, interestingly, in my observation, and it's not massive numbers, so people will say, you haven't got huge numbers, true. But they tend to do quite well, and their quality of life is improved significantly if they've got less muscle tension spasticity and less tremor. Because just simple basic things like trying to pick up a cup of coffee, if your muscles are stiff and twitching a bit, it makes your life quite hard.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting. I was just listening to you then. Were you saying that there's potentially people that come to you from more traditional therapies, people that have been seeing the neurologist, haven't found relief in what they're doing, and then would come to a cannabis specialist, if you will, and then actually find that relief that they've been searching for? Is that something that you would say is a common occurrence, or?
Look, I'd say that, like, the way medicinal cannabis at this stage is configured in this country is that it can only be used when other treatments have failed or caused unacceptable side effects.
Yeah.
So almost by definition, everybody who's coming along to inquire about medicinal cannabis has been and actually needs to have been. Like, you can't get an application approved if it's, this person's got symptoms, have they taken anything? No. Well, that will get knocked back. They don't have to, as you know, they don't have to have taken truckloads of different treatments, but yes, they do need to have tried and failed conventional treatments, and that's, look, I think to a degree that has some merit, but I think where we need to get to with medicinal cannabis, and hopefully we will do it over the next 3 to 5 years or so, is that it is also seen and as a legitimate treatment. So therefore, why should you have to have tried something else first? Now, look, we're not there yet, and I don't think it's about to change next week. And for, in a lot of instances, people may prefer to try other medications first, because if they're PBS subsidized and they work for them, then that's obviously going to be a cheaper option. So it's in no way wrong to try longer established treatments first. But there'll be people who say, well, cannabis has been established for 4,000 or 5,000 years, so it's not exactly new. We're treating this as this new substance, but in some respects, you could say that it's actually older than most of what we'd call established treatments.
Yeah, and some people just think they've been having it for 4,000 or 5,000 years. It's just been a night on the couch. But just curiously, now on that, I'm sure that I've heard doctors say that patients do come to them sometimes having said, I have tried medicinal cannabis outside of the legal framework, if you will, or, CBD, I bought it online, or my friend used to smoke joints. Yeah, that kind of thing. What's your view? Does that change your view as a prescriber when somebody comes with that kind of anecdotal base, or is it something that you maybe disregard as not really, relevant?
Look, it's not I suppose in my opinion, it's not an issue. I don't see that as a reason why people can't or shouldn't proceed with, with medicinal cannabis. If they've had a reasonable response, if they've come in and said, look, I have used something illicitly and it improved my symptoms, that arguably is encouraging. Now, the one catch in all of this is that when you buy something online or from your mate down the street, you don't necessarily know what you're getting.
Of course.
Both from the point of view of, it might say nothing on it, but even if the label does say X milligrams of THC and Y milligrams of CBD, it may have nothing of the sort in it, and you don't know what else it has in it. In fact, there was a study done by the University of Sydney where they asked people to submit products that they were using, and I don't think one correlated with what was supposed to be in it. That said, if people have had some sort of response and it's positive, I think that is a very soft indicator that they may respond to medicinal cannabis. But I don't personally see that it's a reason not to use it. Arguably, it's a reason to use it, because if it is helping and there is some legitimacy to what they're doing in terms of its effectiveness, then much better to have a known product with known quantities, and that it doesn't have impurities in it, and that the next bottle you get and the one after that and the one after that is going to have the same components.
Well, yeah. Just on that point, I suppose, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that factors into if you were, say, for example, applying on a patient's behalf for their access to medicinal cannabis products on the special access scheme, that the fact that they might have had a black market, quote unquote, product, that doesn't at all have any real material use in the clinical justification from the doctor's perspective, if it's not a tested product where we know the quantities of cannabinoids and so on.
Okay, so people will do all sorts of things. The issue in terms of prescribing, and this is a bit more at a different state health levels than at a federal level with the TGA, is if they're, and in New South Wales as well, if you are a registered drug addict or you have a known history of drug misuse. Now that's quite different. That is very, very different to, somebody might have used some herbal medication which they think has got CBD in it, or maybe somebody's let them use something which, look, if you want to be a purist, they shouldn't have done, and I'm absolutely not advocating that people do this. But that's not the same as having a history of substance misuse or being a registered addict. So in those two situations, it is a problem. But that's fairly rare. And look, let's face it, something like 20 to 40% of the adult population may well have used or experimented with cannabis in some way, shape, or form during their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly know a few in that category. But just a question on that prescribing piece we've been discussing. Is it the case that, and I tend to get this feedback from a lot of doctors that I speak to about this idea of so-called, the need for a patient to have tried a conventional treatment and it either didn't work or they suffered a bad side effect from it. Take I suppose broadly, the opioid crisis that we've seen. Is it sufficient for a patient to just simply say, I'm not interested in getting onto even a codeine or an endone or something strong of an opioid, that really just, that I'm worried about dependency issues. I'm worried about the potential side effects that we read about with those classes of drugs. Is that something that would cut it? I'm just asking really broadly here.
That's a very good question. It probably, the answer probably comes from a different direction. If somebody has pain that hasn't required them to use any prescription type medication, then I suppose the question does arise as to, how severe is that pain? And again, that's obviously subjective for the individual. Yeah. So, codeine was until 2018 available over the counter. People could buy formulations that had small amounts in them. The issue with having tried other treatments is as with a lot of bureaucratic requirements, is subject to interpretation. And when I do talks for doctors, I'll say there's no set number of treatments that have to have been tried, and there's no set length of time that they need to have been tried for, and there's no set level of side effect that needs to be reached. So that I don't want to take it at all is probably not acceptable. That I took it a few times and it caused variably, caused me a headache, caused me constipation, caused me nausea. You don't have to have done this 50 times to be able to say that this medication was disagreeable to me.
Yeah.
So somebody, and Payne is the example, says, look, I haven't used anything on prescription, then I think that is going to make it harder for an application to get up, because I think it could be deemed that the problem is not at the sort of level where medicinal cannabis at this stage in the eyes of the authorities comes in. Now, strangely, next year, this year, as you know, CBD has been downscheduled to Schedule 3. So by the time there are products available over the counter, and there aren't any at the moment, and I would not expect anything till at least the back half of 2022, then all of a sudden we've leapfrogged from you have to have gone down this path of having tried a few things. And look, you could say that if people have had an anti-inflammatory, and an ibuprofen probably qualifies as an anti-inflammatory, and paracetamol, and maybe they've tried a couple of, over-the-counter type painkillers. Well, look, in the right circumstances, maybe like Voltaren or diclofenac, maybe that's going to be just enough to fly. But, doctors, when they put in an application, are, basically confirming that they're taking legal responsibility for that the information that has been presented is correct and true. But when it goes to S3, we're going to go from this very convoluted system to people just buying it at the chemist, and bypassing the ability for people just to go in and get a regular prescription without having to jump through all of these hoops. So there are some improvements that could be made in the regime, I think it's fair to say.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely, and we touched on Parkinson's there for a second, but there's a couple of other areas that I did want to talk to you about as well, given we haven't really talked about them on the podcast yet. One of them being, in particular, autism. I know we've had a few people reach out to us and express interest in wondering if it works for that particular indication. I'd love to get some of your background or experience, if you've prescribed much for that particular indication, and what your observations have been. Yeah.
Interestingly, a fair bit of work out of Israel showing, significant benefit in symptoms and behaviours in autism. Now, autism spectrum disorder is, as the name spectrum says, very, very broad, from the mildest through to the most severe. And often, particularly in child and teenage years, they will go through sometimes a series of different pediatricians and psychiatrists. They will sometimes have a variety of diagnoses, because there's no absolute diagnostic test for autism. And I have seen not a massive number, but a reasonable number of those who are with adult autism, and also some teenagers who have been, variably diagnosed with anxiety, depression, ADHD, autism, depression, sometimes a host of different treatments, and have been on a sometimes almost scary number of psychotropic medications, because there is no specific medication for autism. You cannot treat autism as such. It's a way people are put together. You can treat some of the symptoms, and that can include anxiety, it include anger, it can include insomnia or problems with sleep. And if there's associated attention issues, then they might be put on, dexamphetamine or some of the ADHD medications. I had a couple of people in that cohort who really have done remarkably well on CBD. And CBD would be, and absolutely in anybody under 18, would be the absolute preferred and arguably, one could argue, only formulation that should be used in adults, probably a little bit more scope. And in fact, under the age of 16, you can't prescribe THC in Australia without specialist input anyway. But CBD seems to have a very beneficial effect in certain situations, in terms of anxiety, behaviours, calmness. The what gets reported back both by the individual and also by the parents, where there's a good response, is that the person is more calm. They're able to go about their daily life in a much better manner. They're often sleeping better. They're less anxious, able to do what perhaps the rest of us might take for granted, catch the bus to school, stick around with friends for a longer period of time rather than have to pace up and down and around the room. So the impact, when it does work, and obviously, for anybody listening to the broadcast, it's not saying, well, yes, this is the answer to everybody's to everybody's prayers, but certainly where it does work, the impact can be quite significant. For others, there's improvement. They still got their problems. It's not taking away the fact that there is autism spectrum, but the ability to improve the mood, to improve behaviors, to lessen anxiety, to sometimes perhaps increase and improve concentration and focus, and generally to improve the quality of life for both the individual and the parents, can be quite significant.
Yeah, and I think that's the key. We hear a lot reported. It's not a cure. It's not a way to fix entirely anything. But the quality of life standard seems to be the one thing that people report, if they do report it working, to be it.
Yeah,
similarly,
is it interactions as well? I think I've read about human interactions improving as a result of, I guess, that laundry list that you just went through, Joe. But yeah, is that something you'll get feedback from, I guess, people around?
Yeah, look, better socialization, which I suppose is a function of improvement in a lot of those symptoms.
Yeah, attention and anxiety potentially. Yep. Yeah, for sure. And similarly, another area we find that has, it's not the same, but the similar markers for improvement. I think PTSD is another one we hear about, and I'd also love to grab. I'm just going to put you on the spot. We're not going to go through each indication individually, but maybe we'll cap it at this one on PTSD and get a few thoughts from you on that particular indication, because we'd love to explore that.
Yeah, PTSD, another condition where there are no medications. People may be put on antidepressants if they have depression associated with PTSD. They might be put on anti-anxiety medications if they have anxiety associated with it, sleep medications if they have insomnia, but there is no specific treatment for PTSD pharmaceutically. Generally, it's more about psychological remedies, and a lot of those people respond very, very well to that. But those who some people do quite well, again, as before, not everybody, important point to make always, on medicinal cannabis in terms of, I suppose, in a similar but different way to autism and also to dementia, without treating the underlying problem. It does improve mood, it does lessen anxiety, it lessens the fear. There is, some theories that say the stress that people feel in post-traumatic stress disorder revolves around a disturbance in the endocannabinoid system, and therefore and again, these are theories, and therefore by putting in exogenous cannabis, you're correcting some of those imbalances. And the other, and this is a little bit off topic, the other space that I think we'll be watching over the next few years in PTSD is psychedelics.
Yeah.
And MDMA in particular seems to be able to rewire the brain, that you don't forget the trauma, but you remember it without the emotion. So yes, I remember that happened, but instead of reliving it with it like it's raw and real and all the fear and the emotion that comes with it, you seem to just remember it. And medicinal cannabis, nobody knows the exact mechanism, but it does appear that for people where they get a good response, you get the same sort of impact, that they don't forget the trauma, whether it was a motor vehicle accident, whether it was an assault, whether they've been, shot, whatever it might be, keeping in mind the original diagnosis of PTSD started with war veterans. So they're not forgetting it, but they're not impacted by it. It becomes in the past rather than being relived in the present. And, that would intuitively make some sense that it's a rebalancing of the endocannabinoid system. We can't say that that is or isn't the case. You know, one day we may be able to.
Yeah, excellent.
I'm curious on that point, because with psychedelic medicine, I imagine, I mean, the TGA came out recently and said they weren't prepared to down schedule it for it to be prescribed. I think it's only still Schedule 9 and being put through clinical trials. I'm just curious on your perspective as someone who has, you know, worked as a doctor, you know, for many years. These particular substances that are the subject of discussions about psychedelic medicine, and I am referring to psilocybin and MDMA. How do you feel as a doctor just about the fact that these are actually now being discussed as medicines? And do you have any thoughts about psilocybin?
Yeah. Look, it's interesting. The TGA hasn't downscheduled it. Equally, the federal government has allocated $15 million to research in this area. So it's one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. The work that's coming out of Canada and North America, again, is very encouraging. And in terms of PTSD, it's you know, MDMA assisted psychotherapy. So it's not just you know, take these tablets and away you go. It's incorporated with psychotherapy. Psilocybin in severe depression, there have been some trials. In fact, there was one published a couple of months ago, which was very, very notable because it compared psilocybin to an SSRI medication. Now, Prozac was the first of those. Fluoxetine, there've been, you know, a dozen or more subsequently. And this trial actually compared psilocybin to an SSRI and actually found psilocybin to be superior in terms of improvement in depressive symptoms. So it's an area that's fascinating. And it's what we're seeing now is a renaissance of interest in psychedelics, which is sort of running a few years behind medicinal cannabis. And both of them went out of favor. So in the 60s, there was research being done in psychedelics because they thought, well, these could be medical treatments. And then, rightly or wrongly, it got picked up by the counterculture and then got sort of wrapped up into the war on drugs. And everybody sort of forgot that the beginning of it was not a recreational substance at all. The beginnings of it was to be medication. But, you know, it all got sort of wrapped in, say, with the Nixon administration's war on drugs. And everybody then sort of, I suppose, forgot all about it or just didn't want to know about it. And, you know, now we're picking up the pieces with cannabis.
Yeah.
You know, 100 years ago, it was prescribed for uses pretty much like we're using today. And then it became a prohibited substance. And now we're saying, oh, this is all new. Well, yeah, we're just picking up the pieces from where we were previously.
I think it's kind of funny that we're seeing the psychedelics and MDMA and the rest follow cannabis like that a few years behind. It's almost like it's a gateway drug, I'd say.
Well played, Mitch. Very nice. Very nice.
Dear.
Yeah.
But I think there is, if you look at the North American experience and in Canada in particular, and they've had a medicinal cannabis industry for 20 years or so, you can sort of see that where psychedelics are is probably where cannabis might have been 10 or 15 years ago.
Sure.
And people are interested. There's enough people at the forefront who are saying, we want to find out more. We don't want to charge out and make claims or, you know, we don't want to do things. It sounds silly to say. We don't want to say do things that are silly, but equally, we don't want to ignore the potential for benefits. And certainly in refractory depression, where we know antidepressants don't cure it, they just control the symptoms. And in PTSD, where people may get no relief, then certainly substances which offer the potential for significant improvement, and again, it won't be for everybody. You know, I think society's getting to a point where it's prepared to actually acknowledge that maybe we need to look at that which was, you know, cast aside and say, well, we need to revisit this.
Well, it's interesting how even the ABC, I was listening to a podcast a couple of months ago about a guy who, I don't want to say went undercover, but he basically went to a spiritual retreat where everyone was taking ayahuasca and they had a shaman and people would take it under a kind of in a controlled environment. It was supervised. I wouldn't say akin necessarily to the practices and procedures of the assisted psychotherapy clinical trials that we've just been speaking about. But I was just curious, do you think maybe one day that one might also be in the frame for discussion?
Look, it's a good question, Andrew, and I didn't hear that podcast, but I've heard of those sorts of experiences, which I think generally people undertake more for sort of for personal rather than medical reasons. So I think people who generally go down that path do it more, like you say, for spiritual awakening or opening up. Again,
Yeah,
people
precisely.
have opinions on that, and I'm not expressing one, but I don't think at the moment there's anything on the horizon that says it would be seen as a medical treatment. But we're talking here in 5 years' time. Who knows?
Well, you guys
Yeah,
just
and
got,
I think
I saw in March this year, WA elected 2 senators. And I got to say, the state where you live, I'll never quite understand the politics. There's not a lot of love for Labor at the federal elections, but then there's a lot of love for them at the state elections. And then we get 2 senators being elected from legalized cannabis WA. Do you have any thoughts about that? Do you feel like WA, with all the work that is going on in the industry over there? I know Little Green Pharma has sort of been the pioneer, but there's a few other operations coming up as well. Do you feel like your state could be the first to go recreational?
Yeah. Look, look, I can't really express an opinion on that. And look, the 2 people who got elected in particular, Brian Walker, who is also a GP by profession, I think in the upper house, brought out the fact that in 2003, the then Labor government had actually moved to decriminalise personal possession of, I think it was similar to the ACT, I think 2 plants or up to a certain number of grams of cannabis. And I think he asked in the upper house, well, is this still Labor policy, or has this been removed from the statutes? And I think he was greeted with pretty much stunned silence. The Premier is on the record as not being supportive, and given that he pretty much rules the roost and has control of both houses, I wouldn't be predicting any change anytime soon. But stranger things have also happened.
Interesting.
I think at the end of the day, at least when I think about it, it's mostly about harm reduction. And I know you're keenly interested in that space as well, Joe. And I'd maybe love to hear a little bit about, for example, tobacco harm reduction, which is something we haven't actually touched on in this podcast series yet. Yeah.
Yeah, look, ultimately, I think Jimmy Carter is probably not going to go down in history as one of the greatest American presidents, but he did say something that I think was very worthwhile about the policies on drugs. And he said our policies on drugs, as a very minimum, should do no more harm to the individual than the substances themselves. And I'm not sure I've got that absolutely word for word. And when we put people in jail for, possession of small amounts of drugs, I think we are doing them more harm than the substances themselves, especially when we're talking about, cannabis in particular. So, yeah, look, with tobacco harm reduction, we know from international jurisdictions, and I should point out that I'm the chairman of Australian Tobacco Harm Reduction Association, and we are supportive of and provide education on ways for people to stop smoking. It's been known for nearly 60 years now that smoking causes lung cancer, causes a whole host of other medical problems, and yet people still continue to smoke. And we also know that there are a number of ways for people to stop smoking, and that includes throwing away the cigarette packet, it includes patches, gums, sprays, medications. There's no shortage of them. And despite all of these, people still continue to smoke. And we know that in Australia in the 1980s, we were at the forefront of reducing cigarette smoking, and that was really good. But now in the 2010s, we are really the laggard. And the reason we're the laggard is that countries such as the UK, the USA, the EU, Japan, Scandinavia, Canada, they all support the use of vaping liquid nicotine as tobacco harm reduction. It is not for children, it is not for people who don't smoke to take up, but it is at least 95% less harmful than smoking. In New Zealand, they have a proposal to be smoke-free by 2025. I think that's probably fairly optimistic, It's only 4 and a bit, it's only 4 years away. But if you go to the New Zealand Ministry of Health site, you will see that they support vaping, and they show you that it is an alternative to smoking. People smoke because they want the nicotine. They don't want all these other chemicals, but smoking means they get the nicotine with all these other chemicals. If you can offer people nicotine, as we do in patches and sprays and gums, and you don't even need a prescription. You buy them at the chemist, you buy them at the supermarket, and that's all fine. But as soon as you put it into a liquid form, you get the public health lobby who say, oh no, this is all terrible, we can't do this. And unfortunately, for better or worse, the health minister is a bit of a captive of the health department and the public health lobby. So if you look at the New Zealand approach and you look at our approach, which is this horrendous prescription-based model, it's just not going to work. What we want is for it to be no harder for people to obtain an at least 95% less harmful option. So if you can go to the supermarket, if you can go to the petrol station, if you can go to the deli and you can buy cigarettes, and you can do that, it's absolutely, you can do it if you're over the age of 18, then you should be able to buy a less harmful alternative. And New Zealand and in the UK, you can do it. In the UK, they run campaigns. They run public health campaigns encouraging people to switch to vaping. So, in this country, unfortunately, we are an outlier. We really are an outlier. In the entire OECD, it's only Australia and Turkey that do not have vaping of liquid nicotine as a consumer product.
It's absolutely fascinating to me hearing all that, because I do think about how advertising campaigns such as the one you've described in New Zealand is really money well spent. If you think about the reduction of smokers taking in carcinogenic chemicals and the decreased burden possibly on oncology departments. But it's also fascinating to hear insights and to think that Australia in the course of, say, 10 years has dropped behind, because I do recall that about 10 years ago, when the debate was happening around plain packaging, Australia was at the forefront then, at least with respect to that proposal. And it seems like we did that, and I've observed cigarette prices have gone up significantly over that time. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on those measures versus vaping? I imagine you'd probably say vaping is more effective.
Well, I think the history shows that plain packaging made people feel like they were doing something. So it gives a warm inner glow to the politicians and the public health lobby, because it's all, to them, it's not about helping smokers, it's about fighting big tobacco. Now, sure, the tobacco companies want their labels and they want their brands. Sure, they do. So, but these sort of moves like plain packaging, if people want to smoke, they'll smoke. And Australia has the highest per stick price of cigarettes in the world. And yet in the US, where prices are about nearly a third of what they are in Australia, in the UK, where they're half, they now have lower rates of smoking because people are switching to vaping. So you can keep jacking the price up, and every time that happens, there will be some people who may stop. But the higher you jack it up, the more people either A, miss out on buying other other items that they might need, and that might include food for their children, that might include clothes. And the other one that happens is they go to the black market, and the amount of black market tobacco now coming into Australia is enormous. So you really, and if it's got a plain package, well, look, fine, I don't have any problems either or, but I don't think when you look at the actual rates of smoking, it can be said in any way that has been successful in reducing the smoking rates. It hasn't. I'm sure it's a clip around the ears to big tobacco. Hooray, we can all feel warm and fuzzy and like we've achieved something. But if our aim is to actually help smokers quit, if that's our aim, then it's been a failure.
So you would probably be against the laws that are, well, coming in very soon around nicotine vaporizers is it October or November?
So the current situation is that you do need a prescription to import nicotine liquid from overseas. And there's estimated to be between 300,000 and 500,000 vapors in Australia. And I'd say that probably 98 or 99% of those are currently in breach of the laws. So the new laws coming in on October 1 are actually a tightening up. So what will be interesting is to see whether those laws are then enforced, because they certainly haven't been so far. There will be capacity for the first time for nicotine liquid to be purchased in Australia on prescription. But we're going to need, or people are going to need, a SASB, a bit like the medicinal cannabis prescription. And like with medicinal cannabis, most doctors probably won't be happy to go down that path, either because they won't understand it. And I get that. I make no criticism of the doctors, because it is complicated. And, you know, notwithstanding the government's introducing this, they're really not running adequate education to either tell vapers or doctors that this is coming and what they need to do. So the view of ATRA is that this is going to cause a lot of problems. And the worst thing that is likely to happen is that people will actually go back to smoking. So not only won't it help reduce smoking rates, there's every likelihood that it will increase smoking rates.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine becoming an AP for a nicotine vape would be a hard sell, I imagine.
Well, look, I think rightly or wrongly, doctors by their nature do tend to be a little bit conservative. They're worried about new things. They're worried about getting sued. They're worried about Medicare jumping on their backs. They're worried about the medical board jumping on their backs. So something of this nature, which is sort of new, it doesn't have the support of most medical bodies. They're just going to feel like they just don't want to feel they're going to stick their neck out. Notwithstanding, they don't want to help their patients. There's only so far a lot of people feel that they're prepared to stick their neck out, and that's a real problem. ATRA is looking to do what it can to try and provide some education, but you know, like seriously, we run on the smell of an oily rag. We don't get millions of dollars of government funding like the opponents of vaping. You know, they all sip latte in their university rooms and just coast around on government funding. We don't get any of that.
Well, speaking of government funding, I was just thinking as you were talking about the advertising campaign that would be running in New Zealand and could be running in Australia. I think Australia spent, so when we introduced plain packaging, Philip Morris took Australia to court under investor state dispute resolution provisions in our free trade agreement with Hong Kong, citing that the Australian government infringed on its IP. I think we spent about $24 million, or Australian taxpayers did, funding that legal case, which Australia did win, admittedly, in 2015. But we had that sort of money lying around. I feel like we could put together a handy little vaping campaign. It's really, yeah.
I remember, I think the then health minister, and I could stand corrected on this, but I think the then health minister was Tanya Plibersek. And I do remember reading a transcript where she was asked about Treasury estimates on sort of forward revenues for cigarette excise money. And was more or less asked, well, is there any such prediction that over the forward estimates, there'll be a reduction in tobacco excise based on plain packaging? And the answer to that was no. That sums it up, I think.
It really does. I just curious, I suppose the tobacco harm reduction work that you're doing sort of ties in generally with, with the work. I think you've held senior positions at the AMA, and we talked before recording about how you're a bit of a radical doctor, Joe. What's some of the practical/radical advice that you give to your patients generally? Do you have are you stickler for sort of giving people a set amount of time that they should be exercising per week, or?
Yeah, look, you're right, Adam. This is literally in the last century. I held some positions in the AMA. It was in the 90s. Look, it was interesting. You do what you can. I suppose I formed a view that there's probably better ways to advance some causes, and subsequent to that, I got involved in. I'm still involved to some degree in the management of medical centres and the corporatisation of general practice, which has led to, I think, better delivery of services, not because of me personally, but the whole industry. And look, about a decade ago, I wrote a book called Do It Yourself Health, which is all about exercise, sleep, stress management, relaxation, relationships, diet, exercise, really saying, looking after your own health is key. And if you put the right sorts of, like a car, if you put the right fuels into it, you keep the radiator topped up, if you keep the tires pumped where they're supposed to be, the car will probably run better. And it's the same with the human body. And we know that in Western society, something like 75 to 80% of the disease burden are what are called chronic lifestyle related conditions. And obviously, COVID sort of reminded people about viruses. But, again, if you look at the death toll from COVID on a global scale, in terms of the deaths from cancer, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, et cetera, it remains quite small. You wouldn't think that if you listen just to the media, but if you actually look at the numbers, very much the case. And a lot of these conditions are not totally preventable, but your chances can be reduced significantly. If you don't smoke, you're much less likely to get lung cancer or heart disease. It can happen, it's less likely to. If you're eating, proper, good food, sensible food, a Mediterranean type diet, vegetables, good quality protein, rather than lots of processed grains and lots of sugary foods, you're less likely to get, type 2 diabetes. If you don't drink too much, you're less likely to get liver problems. Yes, you can have a drink. I like a glass of wine myself. I won't pretend otherwise. If you do some regular exercise, it's good for your bones, it's good for your heart, it's good for your lungs, it's good for your mental health. So there's so much that people can do on a day-to-day basis to manage and maintain their own health. A bit like maintaining your own car. If you wait for it to break down and go to the mechanic, they might be able to fix it up for you, but it's probably going to be a lot more expensive, and you're going to think, well, could this have been prevented? And with the human body, there's a lot where you can reduce the likelihoods, and rather than have to go to the doctor after your body's sort of breaking down, maybe try and keep it in better nick as you go.
Great analogy.
Yeah, it is actually. And I suppose, it really does tie into, I suppose, the theme of our whole podcast is just around alternative medicine. And even just hearing you speak, it really does expand that beyond, the topic of medicinal cannabis, which we are often going on about. It's, it's incorporating, if you're being prescribed that product, incorporating that into, good sleeping habits, good diet habits, exercise. But apparently you saying these things renders you a radical. So it's been a pleasure having such a radical doctor on the podcast.
Well, look, what can one say? But that's probably, look, I think the idea of sort of Western and alternative medicine, these are all jargon terms. Really what we should be about is helping people to be as healthy as they can be. Now, that may at times mean that people need pharmaceutical medications, and some of them can be literally life-saving. But we don't and shouldn't, in my opinion, be reliant on pharmaceutical medications when there are other steps and actions that we can do and take as individuals in terms of diet, exercise, sleep, and stress management, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah, it seems unfortunate that diet and exercise would be viewed as an alternative medicine to some, but I for sure know that it is in some particular cases, and sleep for that matter. This has been an incredibly informative podcast. I dare say our viewers will get a lot out of this. And there's any last questions, Andrew, before I think we're...
No, I mean, we didn't really get to pick your brain about Little Green Pharma, but maybe if you can just give us a quick around the grounds about what you're doing there, because I've been so excited watching LGP from the early days. They really were one of the first companies in the space.
So Little Green Pharma was the first company to produce medicinal cannabis in Australia. So to grow, harvest, manufacture, bottle, distribute, and have prescribed and dispensed. And that was a massive achievement by the team, and then went to a listing on the ASX in 2020. And through that, an expansion of the grow facility. Started as a very small facility, obviously a top secret location. Nobody's allowed to know where it is. And then earlier this year, and then last year through COVID, expand the ability to produce has been enormous, and the credit to the team there. And look, earlier this year, capital raise and expansion, and the commitment of the team has always been to getting the best quality, consistent medicinal cannabis product, and be vertically integrated for patients to benefit by. And that's Australian patients, where we have a significant, I believe, portion of the market. I can't give any figures, but also to the export market, and Australia, because this is a plus for some regulations, because of the quarantine and agricultural regulations. Australian products are free of any impurities, and Some countries overseas, the products aren't always free of heavy metals or pesticides or fungicides, and they're not tested for such. So yeah, the LGP team are a great group of people. Yes, I'm biased because obviously I work with them, but even if I didn't, they really are a great group of people and have been able to kick goals and through a very, very difficult time last year, very difficult time for everybody last year, come through and, continue to deliver for, for Australian patients.
That's excellent.
Fantastic.
We'll continue watching the LGP journey, but yeah, it's been amazing so far. And it's been great having you on the podcast. We might well do this again. Whether you're ready for another hour of being peppered with lots of questions by Mitch and I, but it's probably just a testament to, how informative your answers are. So we really appreciate your time.
I see it.
Look, it's been a pleasure to be with you both, and happy to come back on if you'll have me at some point.
We might have you back for the MDMA version in a few years. That could be the next step. It is AltMed after all, so that we are going to be looking at that very much under the microscope as it opens up. So definitely.
Excellent. All right. Well, Dr. Joe, thank you so much for your time. We'll look forward to doing this again soon.
Thanks.
All right.
Cheers.
Take care.